The Novosti Press Agency presents. A military parade was held on November 7, 1967 on Red Square to mark the 50th anniversary of the Soviet state. The armed forces were addressed by the Soviet Defense Minister, Marshal Andrei Grechko. On the 50th anniversary of the Russian Socialist Revolution, the Soviet armed forces assured the Communist Party, the government, and the people that they were prepared to carry out their duty to their country. They would be vigilant in the defense of the gains of the revolution, of communism, and peace. The review of the armed forces was actually a review of its history, from half-starved, ill-equipped detachments of Red Army soldiers to regular units of one of the most modern armies in the world. A grand tradition. The veterans of the Russian Socialist Revolution watched the parade with particular excitement. They recalled how this tradition of reporting back to the people who had formed this army was established in 1918. Those were anxious times. The young Soviet Republic was flanked by the enemy on all sides. The people of Russia rose to the defense of their country. Have you signed up as a volunteer? People volunteered for the Red Army in town and village, and units and detachments were formed of these volunteers. By the end of March 1918, the Red Army numbered 150,000 men. Although small numerically, it was an army nonetheless. And its first parade was viewed by Vladimir Lenin. It has been customary since 1918 to hold such military parades. The Army demonstrated the latest in military equipment, its discipline and training. The Civil War was raging. On several occasions, the participants of parades marched off to the front. They left to the sound of Lenin's impassioned words. Although the army lacked arms, it made good use of the equipment captured from the enemy. New branches of the army came into being, and revolutionary tactics and strategy were forged in battle. Well-trained detachments took part in the military parade on Red Square in 1925. Yet the army was still ill-equipped. The country was only beginning to create its own industrial enterprises. The first domestic automobiles were turned over to the army. It also received the first domestic aircraft. The army got the tanks first made in this country and seen by the people at the 1932 military parade. In the meantime, the voice of fascism resounded ever louder. Hitler, Goering, and Mussolini were openly planning to redivide the world. The Italian fascists bombed Abyssinia. German and Italian fascists attacked Republican Spain. In the Soviet Union, a number of garrisons held maneuvers to check the Red Army's military preparedness. Numerous foreign military specialists viewed the maneuvers. The Soviet government proposed a collective defense system to the Western powers, but no reply was forthcoming. The Soviet Union was forced to take measures to ensure its own safety, to rely on itself alone. Still, the Soviet people hoped that common sense would prevail and prompt the Western countries to realize that the Red Army had the strength to break fascism's back. The complement of officers was more experienced. The army began to acquire new armaments and equipment developed by Soviet specialists. The unity of purpose between army and people grew everywhere, in town and village. Ordinary folk displayed affection for the country's defenders. Yet the fascists' attack on the USSR could not be averted. They concentrated more than 200 divisions on the Soviet Union's Western Front and treacherously attacked the USSR, despite the Soviet-German non-aggression pact. Taking advantage of the fact that the Soviet armed forces were undergoing reorganization and that at the time they were outnumbered in men and equipment, the fascists scored considerable success. On the 6th of November 1941, the front was only 60 kilometers from Moscow. Hitler fascists considered that Moscow's and Russia's fate was settled. A traditional military parade was held on Red Square November 7th. It demonstrated the Red Army's preparedness to defend the country. The People's Volunteer Corps participated in the parade, as did the best Soviet tanks of those days, the T-34. And once again, just as during the Civil War, the armed forces marched to the front right from the parade. On December 6, 1941, the armies of the Western Front launched a decisive counteroffensive. Hundreds of thousands of fascist soldiers and officers met their end in the snows near Moscow. Those who remained alive continued on their way to the east, but under reliable convoy. Many Hitler fascists did get to the Soviet capital, it is true, but much later, after the defeat of the enemy at Stalingrad, the Kursk Bulge, and in Belorussia. After liberating many European countries from fascism, the Soviet armed forces ended the war in Berlin. And the country honored its heroes. A victory parade was held on Red Square in the summer of 1945. The banners and standards of Hitler's armies were cast down in front of the Lenin Mausoleum. The long-awaited peace prevailed at last. For the army, it was a time of persistent training and mastering of military science. To counter the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Soviet Union and other socialist countries were forced to form a mutual defense alliance, the Warsaw Pact, which today too can be depended upon to safeguard the peace. The USSR has created powerful nuclear weapons. Soviet people pioneered the conquest of outer space. Soviet missiles were demonstrated for the first time at the parade to mark the 40th anniversary of the Russian Socialist Revolution. 2 years later, the Soviet Union announced the creation of a new branch of the armed forces, Strategic Missile Forces. Missiles became the main strike force of the infantry, the anti-aircraft defense units, the Navy, and the Air Force. In the spring of 1964, a Soviet atomic-powered submarine sailed under the Arctic ice and surfaced at the North Pole. The Soviet flag was raised at the pole. At the time the submarine's crew saluted the flag, the 1st of May salute resounded in Moscow. On that day, millions of Soviet people could see once again the achievements of Soviet scientists, designers, and inventors. A great variety of military equipment was on the move through Red Square. Missiles to protect the skies overhead. Missiles for the Navy. Missiles capable of reaching any point on the globe. The Soviet Air Force had changed beyond recognition. So had the Navy. It became atom-powered and missile-equipped. The infantry, the oldest branch of the Soviet armed forces, had undergone great changes too. A revolution in military science had altered the infantry greatly. This was evident at the Dnieper maneuvers held in the autumn of 1967. As always, during these maneuvers too, the armed forces felt the people's affection. Wherever they appeared, they were always met with flowers and the traditional bread and salt. In the Soviet Union, where the army and the people are in complete accord, this is also tradition. One of the commanders in charge of the Dnieper maneuvers was the chief of the General Staff of the Soviet Armed Forces, Marshal Matvey Zakharov. Soviet armed forces have earned a good reputation by their heroism, loyalty to country and people, and faith in the ideals of the great Lenin and the Communist Party. They won it in hard battles with the enemy.
Ее в жестоких боях с врагами. И если грянет новое испытание, оно будет выдержано. Советские вооруженные силы...
The Soviet armed forces stand on guard of the people's constructive labor, happiness, and peace. Defending the peace is the grandest of the Soviet armed forces traditions. A Central Documentary Film Studios production.